Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining the South Carolina High School League and members of our distinguished press. I'm Tammy Newman, the Director of Communications and Public Relations for the High School League. Today, we had a wonderful conversation with some very distinguished panelists previous to this webinar, and today, right now, we're going to be able to have an online live press conference with Commissioner Jerome Singleton. I just would like to go over a couple of housekeeping rules. Please be mindful of your environment. Make sure that you're in a quiet space. Let's keep the noise to a minimum. If you can, turn off cell phones or at least your ringers. And again, a reminder that this is on Facebook Live, so let's all keep that in mind with the vast variety of viewers. Before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that we are going to be discussing the 2021 South Carolina High School League guidelines for Phase 1 of return to play. Hopefully we'll all stay on topic and help our athletic programs get up and running. We look forward to answering your questions. I think we can get started. I just want to ask everyone, if you're familiar with Zoom, make sure that you utilize your mute and unmute aspects, and when you raise your hand, I will be looking for that and call on you for those questions. Okay, and I believe we're going to get started with Mr. Singleton has an opening statement.
Good afternoon, media. We once again thank you for your time and your coverage, helping us deliver information about education-based athletics to the general public. It is the goal of the South Carolina High School League to provide these guidelines for a safe return and helping our member schools to implement check-in and check-out procedures for workouts, provide screening for COVID-19, and education to coaches relative to how to maintain appropriate social distancing while providing our students with an opportunity to resume conditioning and training activities with their teammates. We know that these workouts will look different than most traditional summer workouts, and we want to make sure that our full membership is on the same page about what is allowed and what is not allowed during this initial restarting phase. This is unprecedented territory, and while we hope for a full return to activities soon, we know that conditions change rapidly relative to this virus. As the league has done throughout the pandemic, this decision will be made in a staggered fashion. The South Carolina High School League will continue to use the most up-to-date information to guide decisions about how and when a return to athletic activities could happen, including what next steps are necessary to allow for a relatively low-risk return to athletic activities for our member schools and the students. We recognize that it will not be possible to prevent every student athlete from contracting COVID-19. However, there are best practices that can help mitigate the possible spread of virus through athletic activity. And it is our goal to do everything in our power to protect the health and safety of student athletes, coaches, and their communities as we consider our next steps. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, and again, I ask that we have the chat option if you want to submit questions, but I think I'm able to see everyone right now, but we can get started. And I think I'm going to start with you, Mr. Blackwell. Jed, are you ready with a couple of questions?
Yeah, I've got a list actually.
We're going to rotate around, so
okay. Sounds good. My first list is my first question, I guess. First, I listened to the previous meeting. It was very informative. Thank y'all for allowing us to listen in on that. It was great. I've had a couple people ask, has there been a thought with districts determining when they're going to get to go back? Has there been a thought toward a possible competitive imbalance with some districts hurrying back and others maybe taking a little more time? Or has that been a consideration at all?
Yeah, Jed, we actually did take in consideration of that. But if you look at what's involved with Phase 1, it's basically just conditioning. And these are conditioning that they still could have done virtually through technology. The only thing that's been added is a limited ability to do some working with the ball. So the first 2 weeks is actually basically conditioning. We don't see that as being a possible competitive advantage. What I would hope is during that time that actually we spend a lot of time talking with the kids, reassuring them that we can move back in this direction. Build some confidence in the parents to allow those kids to come out there and be a part of the program. We're hoping that that takes place. This is not a time for us to determine or find who could be our best athletes, because all of them will be going through those drills. It'll be a time for coaches to reconnect with those student athletes that are probably, some of them that may be struggling at this time. That, to have been separated since March. This athletics in some of those cases are recognized as being an identity event. So a lot of them may be going through some confusion. So a lot of them may be going through some depression. Here's a great opportunity for us to really go back to what our athletics offers other than the X's and O's.
Thank you.
Jed, do you have another you'd like to throw out there while we've got you?
Sure. I'll jump around a couple of different places. Two that have to deal directly with the virus. One, are coaches 60 years old and older permitted to be with their athletes? Do those restrictions or any restrictions just apply to older coaches with extenuating conditions? And following up, staying with the virus theme, say one athlete in a pod is diagnosed with the virus, is the entire pod quarantined, or is it just the one athlete?
Well, as earlier in the online meeting that we had, if it was determined that one of the athletes has been determined to have the virus, then it would require that the entire group being quarantined. That's one of the reasons we asked that we have such a small number, so that we can isolate it and doesn't have an immediate impact on the entire school or the entire team. Just as with everybody else, the coaches of 16 and older being as susceptible to the virus as anybody else that's 16 and older. We just ask that care is taken in place as they work their way through this with their decision as a local decision.
Okay.
Next up, Jess Hartzell.
Hi, Jerome.
Hey,
I'm wondering what the high school league can do to make sure all the schools have the equipment and tests and masks and thermometers that they're going to need. You have a wide variety of schools with a wide variety of resources.
Good question, Jeff. One of the things with that is a lot of those equipment that they're going to use for athletics are probably the same type of equipment that they're going to need to use when school reopens. So we're hoping that they're being able to get some help in doing that. Unfortunately, this office doesn't have anything there other than to continue to keep in front of them the need to have those sanitary equipment that's needed to be able to offer these activities. But it's the same thing that will be needed or be offered during the school day when school reopens.
Okay.
And Jerome?
I believe next in line was Lou from the state.
Hey, Jerome. A couple questions. The first is, if everything goes according to plan, do you see the season starting on time in August with the first games that weekend as scheduled?
All that depends. Depending on how we're able to move through phases, and the ultimate goal being able to get back to full competition. And it may be realized differently for different levels of risk. But if we go back to full competition, if we can do that, what's the time between our normal starting date and the first opportunity we had to go back to full competition? Well, if that's too close, we'll have to move the starting date. I don't think we should ever let the date dictate the safety of the kids. I think the safety of the kids and the health of the kids should take precedent over any dates that we have in place.
And you talked about this a little bit in the last meeting, but as far as the enforcement, I mean, obviously you can't be at all 200 plus schools in that. So what if a team finds out that they're not going by the rules and that? What would be the penalty, and how important is it for everyone to go by the rules as scheduled?
I'll go back to, again, the biggest penalty that we could possibly have is not having an opportunity to do sports. I don't think any of our membership would like that to happen. And I really believe and trust that our membership will do the right thing so that that doesn't become an issue for us. This is very critical that we begin phase one and have the things in place and follow the things that are in place. And we can always address if something comes up. It's about safety of kids more than any type of competitive advantage taking place right now. So are we willing to compromise the safety of our athletes, all our coaches, in reference, and they have an opportunity to see if I can get one more play in, or whether I can start doing something that we know that's not safe prior to everybody else? I don't believe that to be the case. Again, I'll stick with the penalty is there's a great opportunity that we don't have a chance to play those sports this fall.
Okay. Next question, I believe, is Jed Blackwell.
Back to me. Let me say, I've got a couple of phase 2 ones here. I know we're talking about phase 1 today. In light of a lot of schools having graduation on the football field and having a lot of kids out there 6 feet apart, was there any consideration to using football fields, using larger facilities and doubling up the pods? Was that even considered, or is it just, I realize that now it's hard and fast, one pod, one facility, but was there a consideration for using the bigger facilities to house maybe more than one pod at one time?
Yeah, if you heard it earlier, of course, Dr. Mazaway and Coach Gordon actually both spoke to that, you know, for an opportunity to be organized and put something in place that everybody could follow without any misinterpretation or misunderstanding. While it's not the best use of the facility, I think if we just dictate that there's one pod or one group to each facility, there's little opportunities for misunderstanding. And I think if we're overly safe at the beginning, that can't hurt more so than just trying to find ways to say, well, let's do it a different way. I think we need to go ahead. It's clear cut if we said one group to one facility.
Right.
That's important at this time.
Okay, and before we go back to Lou with the state, I just want to remind everyone that you can raise your hand or send me a chat and let me know that you have a question. But right now we're going to go to Lou with the state has another question.
Jerome, if say like you talk about the pods and these kids are working with the same coach in that pod for a couple days in a row, but say like, can they work with a different coach the next day in that pod? I mean, can coaches rotate between pods while they're at the school?
The hope is that they wouldn't rotate between, that you could take a group and keep them together. But schools have to make some decisions themselves as to how they want to make that work. C2C and DHEC and of course athletic trainers have talked about the risk involved with those type of things. Still, it's a local decision to make those adjustments as they see fit. Because I understand there's a difference in the number of coaches that you may have on a coaching staff. So sometimes it's not feasible to do everything one piece fits all. It's just that a lot of it's got to be left up to a local decision. Just understand the risks that are involved. Some schools may choose not to do this at all. Some schools may say, well, we're only going to work on certain sports coming out of the blocks. The first few weeks is all fall sports. Then once we get that going, maybe we'll move to where we allow winter sports. And then once we get that going, maybe we'll move to spring sports. If there's a group that has a sense of urgency, it would appear that would be the fall sports because they're the first one to have a sports season. So there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to do it. I wouldn't try to dictate that to those schools because it depends on the number of people they got available and help them put those programs in place.
Okay.
Follow up on that. After the end of July, you have that dead period for the other sports. That's 6 weeks. Is there a consideration to eliminate that and let like the basketball and that and baseball can practice those 6 weeks that they normally would have a dead period?
Well, the first thing you're asking us to do is to look in a crystal ball and see where we're going to be. I mean, everything you mentioned is actually hypothetical. Right now, we're in phase one. How long are we in phase one? What will phase two actually look like? A lot of that will be dictated by what comes out of phase one, and then how this virus continues to move around, not just with athletics, but just within the state. All that could bring about changes. As I said earlier, it's got to be fluid because it changes every day. We've been a witness to that, and everybody has been. Early, I mean, it was one thing we thought was going in one direction, and you had to be a 180-degree turn and go back. So I can't predict that. So as we get closer to those type of things, we may start having a discussion on how to best address those things.
Okay. Jess Hartzell?
Yeah, Jerome, are you going to have schools report to the high school league any coaches or players that test positive for COVID, or is there a central place that they can report any positive tests?
Well, I think DHEC would really like to know, and I don't know the protocol, but I think part of that becomes something that DHEC addresses. Anybody that's been tested positive, any information we would have gotten, we would have shared with DHEC also. And I think it'd be a good idea if schools to get it and share that with DHEC. But we don't have anything at this time to report it directly.
Yeah, if players and coaches just report to DHEC, then their numbers will get mixed in with the general numbers, and we won't have an idea of what's going on with this, with the players and coaches.
Sure. So what you have is we're not able to operate in isolation. What happens to the general public will have an impact on what's happening with the schools. What happens with the schools will have an impact on what's going to happen with the general public. So still the same place, the numbers are going to be the same. That's going to have an impact. We are not allowed, or we shouldn't take a chance of trying to operate in isolation of the general public, other than playing our role and trying to keep everybody safe. That's the biggest role we need to play, because the general public won't have an impact on what we're doing, because we're part of the general public. Actually, the student athletes that we work with, and you've heard DHEC speak to that. It's just as important for those kids to be safe and exercise caution when they're away from the school as it is while they're at the school.
Okay, thank you.
And now we have Scott Osberg.
Jerome, a couple kind of questions thrown into one. First, I know you don't have dates set for each phase, but you kind of have penciled in dates where you would like to see phase two, phase three, each phase. Are there penciled in dates that you'd like to see each phase kind of hit at, where it would be an ideal scenario?
Well, no, we got triggers though. We've got triggers that would say, when does it become safe that we can increase the number of people in a group? That's a trigger. When will it become safe? Well, there are other ways to reduce the social distancing of 6 foot. That's a trigger. So I think if those triggers occur, then we can start moving into the phases. I think to put a date there and have no change sets itself up for some challenges. So I think if we pay attention to the triggers, then that gives us an opportunity to move to the next phase.
And my other question would be, are there any extra protocols that could be taken for the more urban schools compared to the rural, just because obviously the concentration of the virus really has been in the urban areas more than the rural areas? Any extra protocols, any extra things that could be done for those schools in the cities?
Well, again, that most of the protocol and precaution that we got came from DHEC and what was in there with CDC. So if there was any additional ones for rule, it would actually begin there than it would as opposed to this office. Again, I'm real careful when I talk about, how prevalent the virus is in one area versus another area. I gotta tell you that we can't afford to have it anywhere, because it impacts somebody regardless of where it is, the exact same way.
Okay, next, Jess Hartzell.
Jerome, you mentioned the triggers for when you'll know when it's time to move to the next phase. How will you determine, whether those benchmarks, whether those triggers have been met?
We'll lean heavily to DHEC, because they've established, where we are now as far as social distancing, gave some recommendation as to social gathering numbers, those type of things are in place. So we would look to the health group to help us determine those type of things.
Thank you.
Lou from the state.
Jerome, say Governor McMaster lifts the limit on crowds and everything, say everything goes back to normal. What will your stance on fans in the stands? Would you guys limit them if Governor says we're able to go back to crowds, large crowds? What's your stance on having fans in the stands this season?
Well, I've got to be honest with you with this, as I have with everything else. Lou, we're trying to look at what's the best way to get our athletes back in a position to compete. We haven't even moved in the thoughts of thinking about what spectators would, what role spectators get to play. Right now, we're just trying to put us in a position where we can get our student athletes, our coaches, and the staff to get an opportunity to compete again. We'll start thinking about the other piece once we get this in place.
And one more question about talk about taking the temperatures and everything at school. Will the trainers be required to do that, or is each school? Will someone different at each school do it, or is it up to the school to decide who's responsible for doing the tests and temperatures each day?
Well, the short answer is we would like for our schools to have a responsible adult to do it. Be it athletic trainers, be it nurses, doctor, or an employee of the school that's full-time in some capacity. And I'd recognize the head coach as being a full-time employee of the school, because it's different for everybody. The guidelines are there. The screen tests are there. A responsible adult, and that we would like to make sure it's an adult, a responsible adult can conduct the screening, be it temperature taking or asking those questions that are part of the screening.
Okay, and back to Scott.
Sorry, my computer kind of crapped out when you were talking at the end of the last meeting about the hydration and whatnot. I lost the whole conversation there, but was it something? I know obviously hydration when it gets to the heat of summer is crucial, but separating kids with water bottles and everything else like that. Could you just discuss what was talked about with the hydration and sharing of water bottles and hope, I guess alleviating the sharing of the communal water?
Yes, we hope that everybody have their own water bottles. We understand that may not be the case for everybody to be able to have one. So we ask that schools put a plan in place. How are you going to hydrate those students if they all don't have water bottles? If you've got to use a cooler, make a plan. And one plan you could use is to have one person actually be responsible for filling cups, or one person being responsible for refilling water bottles. But just have a plan in place of where you pay attention to those sanitary and safety measures to address that. But the hope is that everybody would have their own, bring their own, come to the workouts already hydrated, and hopefully if the workout session doesn't go very long, that the bottle that they have, in addition to their being hydrated, that it suffices that opportunity for during that session.
Okay, now we've got a question from Jed, and then we're going to move to Jeff after Jed Blackwell.
With just preliminary talks at the college level and with the division of sports into separate risk groups, has there been any thoughts moving the lower risk traditional spring sports to the fall and the higher risk traditional fall sports to the spring, flip-flopping the schedule? Has there been any consideration of that?
Not at this time.
Okay, we're going to move on to Jess Hartzell.
Jerome, I just wanted to ask, what is your main concern now as we move toward getting our high school kids back on campus and back working out and getting ready for what we hope is a fall sports season?
I hope that I guess by a wish list, is that we pay attention to the safety measures that has been put in place by DHEC. That we pay attention to any measure that the school has put in place to mitigate the opportunities for the virus to spread even more. If we do those type things and we can make smooth transition from one phase to the next, I feel confident that that we could, if not all sports, we could have fall sports season with sports.
Thank you.
Okay, we are, right now, no one has their hand raised. Are there any more questions out there? This is your time. Let's see. Jed, Lou, have you gotten all the answers that you need?
I'm good.
Okay. Lou? I don't see any.
Well, one more, yeah. What are as far as coaches and that? What are coaches telling you, Jerome, their biggest concern in that? What do you think their biggest concern going into these phase one and everything?
Well, the biggest, I haven't heard a lot of concerns about phase one. I mean, those questions that you heard on the online, there are several of them, and I'm assuming most of those came from coaches. So we answered those, but I think the biggest question we've had from the very beginning, are we going to have a fall sports season? That's the biggest question that I keep hearing. Are we going to have a fall sports season? I'd like for us to.
Okay, and Commissioner Singleton, if you don't mind, I'm going to step over on the other line, on the other side of my duties, and give you a question that was kind of left over from the last meeting. But with fall sports, do you feel there, or do you have any fear or concern that if this virus expands or grows or worsens, are there any particular sports that you feel might be in danger of possibly not happening?
Well, it depends. What does it look like? If social distancing of 6 foot is maintained, and that's the recommendation of the governor, or that's the recommendation of CDC, or that's the recommendation of DHEC, and what we're looking at is probably a national issue. We can look at the sports and see which ones are jeopardized if you've got social distancing. You know, some lend itself to continue to play the sport better than others do. I mean, some of them make some of our sports very prohibitive. And if you have to maintain that, it doesn't help the game. The game doesn't allow itself to have that and be able to be played in the normal fashion that it's always has.
Okay. Are there any more questions? I don't think I have any on my end. I don't have any hands raised or chats. So I think we may have covered everything between the webinar that we had earlier and the approximately 30 reporters that we have online now. Commissioner Singleton, is there anything that you would like to add or stress that we haven't touched on today?
Well, I'll just close by thanking the media for even taking a part in this. You know, you are our ambassadors in getting our message out. That helps us tremendously. We know that there are a lot of places that you could have gotten your news from. Do not find a robbery to come to high school sports and have an interest in that. I can't thank you enough. We're very grateful to the league because of that. We know that you have the same interest in our youth as we do, and we really appreciate your efforts.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes today's first online press conference, and I really do appreciate everyone that participated. And if you come up with a question later on or tomorrow, please do not hesitate to contact us directly. Just because we're closing out this Facebook Live doesn't mean we're not here for you. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send those directly to me or directly to Commissioner Singleton. We are more than happy to, not only speak with you, but to, give you an additional interview. Other than that, I just want to remind you this entire meeting will be available on our Facebook Live. So if there's something that you may have overlooked or want to hear again, it'll be there for you on the South Carolina High School League Facebook. I hope that everyone has a very happy end of the day, and I can thank you again for being with us.